Something awful happened in our little town the week before All Saints' Day. An act of disrespect that felt like a spark in dry grass. What followed was quieter, stranger, and more holy than anybody here could have expected. If you like stories that give you goosebumps, please like this video so more people hear it. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. I'll be telling the rest soon. Your support helps keep these true feeling stories alive. It means everything to a small channel like ours. I remember the night the priest called, and the way his voice went thin over the phone, like the line itself was trembling. We live in a town that has always measured itself by small things. One red light at the crossroads, a diner that still makes pies with lattice crusts, roofs that sag the same way after every winter. The town is called Harrow Ridge, a name somebody joked about once because the hills look like a graveyard from the highway, but people here have always called it home with the kind of stubborn tenderness that peels paint and keeps porches full of jars of pickles. Margaret Pierce lived at the far end of Willow Lane, a narrow road that smells like hay in summer and bitter smoke in November when everyone is burning brush. She'd been a widow for 20 years, small as a teacup and just as fragile. She kept a tidy yard, the kind of yard that makes neighbors nod with approval, because even in winter there were evergreens clipped in neat shapes, a single bird bath with a little iron angel perched on the rim. Inside, her house smelled of lavender and old paper. She read her Bible by the window every morning and called to church on Sundays if she couldn't get to Massachusetts. For 20 years, Margaret's life was as steady as the town clock that never quite kept time. The desecration happened the week before All Saints' Day. A group of kids from the high school, names that would later be said in the police report and at kitchen tables, snuck into the old St. Agnes Cemetery after a football game. They pushed over a small statue of the Virgin Mary that sat under a crabapple tree, broke her hand, and left boot prints in the fresh earth. Someone took a photograph, and the photo went around the town on cell phones like a rumor. You could see the statue's cracked face, the dust on her robes, and the way the moonlight made her eyes look hollow. People were furious. Father O'Leary, who had more years on him than most of the men in Harrow Ridge had lived, called the teenagers blind and careless in the Sunday sermon. He organized a small candlelight procession to the cemetery the next evening. Some of the town's older women brought a jar of holy water and a stack of worn ribbons to tie around the tree. The mayor, who spent half his time arguing about potholes and the other half pretending he was above petty outrage, stood on the courthouse steps and said, into 3 microphones and 2 cameras, that the town wouldn't tolerate disrespect to our symbols. That should have been the end of it. Repairs could be made, a new statue could be purchased from a catalog in the next county. But Harrow Ridge has a way of holding on to things the rest of the world would forget. For decades, my grandmother told me, people here had seen signs, lights over the old mill that no one could explain, a child's cough that stopped after an old woman prayed by the bed, a ribbon untied by wind that later reappeared knotted around a church bell. Legends lined up like chickens in a yard. A soldier who came back from the sea because his mother lit a candle in the wrong month. A winter that came late because somebody asked for mercy. We do not talk much about these things in city voices. We tell them around kitchen tables like we're reminding the house of itself. After the statue was pushed over, small accidents started. They arrived like winter birds one after another, odd and unpleasant, but nothing the town couldn't bear. Mrs. Delgado's prize pig got sick and had to be put down. The pancake house's gas line leaked the week after. Nobody hurt, but the smell lingered for days. A run of flat tires at the feed store that mechanic said just happened. A child slipped on the church steps and broke his wrist. The priest found the tabernacle unlocked one morning. The front door of the church was locked. People who believed in cause and effect started to whisper that maybe someone had been disrespectful and something had answered back. Margaret didn't go to the cemetery the night of the procession. She watched from the kitchen window, her hands on the sill, breath fogging the glass. She said a rosary under her breath and called the phone line for the parish for updates. The procession wound down the hill with candles and whispered prayers. When they reached the broken statue, teenagers in the crowd ducked their heads like guilty dogs. Father O'Leary blessed the grass with holy water and said a prayer that made the streetlights flicker. That night, a cold wind came out of the north, and the town felt as if it had held its breath. A week went by. Then a woman who worked at the post office told me she had dreamt, on consecutive nights, of a woman standing in her doorway. Not a woman she knew, but an older shape, wrapped in a light that smelled like bread and lilies. She woke with a start each morning at the same minute, 2:17 a.m. Another man, a mechanic named Joe, swore he saw the shape of a woman on his porch when he left for work at dawn, a shadow with a thin halo of light, gone when he stepped outside. Enough people started telling such things that the local paper, myself, writing under the column heading around town, ran a small, quiet piece that asked if these were more than coincidence. I spoke to people who lived here all their lives, who remembered the older stories of Harrow Ridge. Old Miss Harlan, who sells quilts through the front window of her general store and whose hands tremble like leaves, told me, "You don't poke at a thing that's been protecting you for years and not expect it to answer back." She referenced a family tradition about a small chapel that used to sit on the hill where the highway runs now, a chapel that once housed a wooden statue of Our Lady that the first settlers brought from Ireland. The chapel burned long ago, and the story goes that the statue was saved because someone placed it in the river and the current carried the statue away to the town's inlet, where a fisherman later found her already dry on the bank. That fisherman became mayor. His children built the present St. Agnes out of that story. Legends take root that way. At the hardware store, a woman named Erin, who works the register and keeps a box of peppermint candies for customers, told me she had seen Margaret the week after the desecration, carrying groceries like she had always done, but her eyes were different. She looked like somebody who'd seen a ghost, Erin said. She kept saying the same thing over and over, that she had to ask forgiveness, even if she didn't know who to ask. I tried to get more from Erin, but she shrugged and said, "You know how people are when the town gets talky." I didn't say anything at first. What I knew from watching Margaret was that she was as careful with her faith as she was with her mail-order linens. Even so, loneliness had wrapped itself around her bones like a shawl. Her son lived hours away in a city with snow in winter and heartbreak in his pockets. He called twice a month, on average. The neighbors brought over casseroles and left them on her porch because manners in Harrow Ridge are sometimes spoken through lasagna. When the humiliating photograph of the smashed statue went around, Margaret sat on her front step and pressed her thumb into the crack of the birdbath angel, as if to feel that the figure was real. People said she would pray more, that she would go to Mass with the candles lit and her hat on proper. I believed them. The town held another meeting at the community center. People wanted to organize a watch, to put cameras up around the cemetery. Others insisted on forgiveness. "We raise kids here," said someone from the school board, "not vandals." The teenagers involved admitted to a stupid joke in front of the principal and the parents. They said they didn't mean to break anything. They apologized. But apology didn't make the cow well again, or fix the broken wrist, or quiet the dreams that woke people at 2:17 a.m. That week, a string of small things happened that started to feel larger because of a pattern. Crows gathered over the cemetery in numbers that made people stop on the road. The church bell rang once at midnight, though no one had touched the rope. The old mill light, an old paint flake of a relic that sits on a hill no signal reaches, came on for an hour and then went dark. Nobody could explain it, because no one lives near enough to wire it on. There was a smell at the train crossing of roses, sweet and a little sharp, though the last roses had long ago frozen away. The local vet said 3 dogs in a single block refused to go into basements they had always loved. You begin to take account of signs when you live in a place that listens. Margaret started sleeping with her Bible under her pillow. She began to keep a small jar of water by the sink, not for drinking, but because she would wet her fingers and cross herself without thinking. One night, a neighbor who lived across the alley, a man named Henry who used to be a coach and now drinks straight coffee at midnight, swore that around 2 in the morning, he heard someone singing the Hail Mary like it was being said for a household. He went outside in his slippers and saw the kitchen curtains of Margaret's house glowing with a blue light. He told me he almost called the police, but then thought better of it. Policemen get used to things here, and some nights we keep our own counsel. I went to see Margaret on a rainy afternoon. She brewed tea and set out a plate of oatmeal cookies that were a little too crisp. She smiled like a woman who understood the value of small comforts. She told me about what had been happening in the town and then said, quietly, "I dream of her sometimes. I see a woman in white at the edge of my yard. She never speaks. She just looks at me like I'm the answer to something I didn't know I asked." I asked Margaret when she'd first felt anything was happening, and she looked at the cracked saucer in her hand and said, "The night the statue was knocked down, I woke up with the shape of a hand on my shoulder. It wasn't cold." I asked if she had told anyone else. She shook her head and laughed softly, a sound like a church bell half muffled. "They'd say I'm old and lonely," she said. "But I don't think it's loneliness I feel. I think it's a thing that knows where I am." She told me she had been to the church several times to kneel, but not for the procession. "It felt like the right thing," she said, "like standing at a door that had been shut for a very long time." I pressed for details. Did she see anyone? Hear anything? She put her hand over mine and squeezed. A small, fierce thing. "Not yet," she said. "But on the eve of All Saints' Day, I feel like something's waiting. I can't put into words, but I wake up with a certainty in my chest the size of a coin." The eve approached like a train you hear long before it appears, slow, inevitable. People started lighting candles in their windows, a habit some said was old tradition, Others said was just something to hold on to. Children practiced the little speeches their grandparents taught them about saints, as if reciting lines from a play. Father O'Leary walked with an extra spring in his step on Wednesday, as if faith alone could steady a town's frayed nerves. The teenagers who had pushed the statue volunteered to scrub the church steps and plant fresh marigolds around what remained of the broken figure. Their hands were careful in a way the town had not seen from them before. Then the night before All Saints' Day came. The sky was clear, the stars sharp like punctuation. About midnight, when the world seems both the smallest and the vastest it can be, something happened at Margaret's house that people will talk about for years. Henry from across the alley said he went out to bring in his garbage and saw a light on her porch. Not the kind of light from a lamp, he said, but a pale, steady glow like the inside of a pearl. The curtains were drawn, but the light came through them as if someone had placed a lantern very close to the glass. He stood there, shivering, and watched the curtains move though there was no wind. Inside, Margaret's silhouette stood perfectly still. He thought she was praying, he told me, but then he saw something he could not explain, a second silhouette beside hers, head inclined. I sat on my recorder and asked Henry if he was sure he hadn't been drinking. He laughed, but not meanly. I don't drink at midnight, no. He paused. I thought at first maybe it was a reflection or a car, but there were no cars. It felt like the house had opened up and a quiet came out. When I left Henry's porch, the town was quieter than I'd seen it in decades. An old woman had once told me that when a place is about to be changed, even the crows fall silent. That is what the night felt like. Margaret did not answer my knock when I went down the next afternoon. Her door was latched, but a light burned inside. I peered in through the slats of the blinds and saw her at her table, hands folded, a plate of untouched cookies in front of her. The only strange thing was the rosary stretched across the table with each bead catching the sun, but the beads glowed a little too bright for something made of plastic. Or maybe it was just the sun, and people see what they need to see. That evening the parish received an anonymous message asking anyone who had seen something to come forward. People came in dribs and drabs. Some wanted to confess things they had done, others just to pray. Margaret came too, wrapped in a navy shawl, and sat in a back pew, shoulders hunched. At 9 o'clock, the lights in the church flickered. The candles on the altar guttered and then blew out, though there was no breeze. The town held its breath. Margaret stood up, walked to the front, and placed both hands on the altar rail. She did not speak. The congregation watched as she lifted her face and began to pray. Her voice was small, but I could hear every word. She said nothing about punishment, nothing about anger. She asked only, in sentences that were simple and direct, for life, for peace, and for the courage to keep going. When she finished, the church remained quiet for a long time. Father O'Leary crossed himself and whispered, "We should go and check on her," but no one wanted to break the hush. The priest's eyes were bright. He had seen things. He had once been in towns where candles answered prayers and where bells tolled on their own. He had never been sure, until now, how small miracles arrive, like a whispered request, like a knock in the dark. I went home that night, listening to the road like a living thing. On my kitchen table, the phone blinked with nothing but old voicemails. The windows held the silhouettes of other houses. People had put out little lamps in their windows, so from the road the town looked like a string of fragile, reluctant lights. That is where I will leave the story for now, on the quiet edge of All Saints' Eve, with Margaret on her knees in a town that is waiting. The neighbors whisper of light, and the children whisper of saints. Some say it is only imagination. Others say the world is larger than we give credit for. The next morning would come with answers, or more questions, and what occurred that dawn would be the kind of thing that changes how a place prays. I walked to the end of Willow Lane that night and stood under the crabapple tree by the cemetery, whose broken statue lay swaddled in newspaper and twine. The moon was full, and the air was so cold it made my breath hurt. Then I saw, across the street, a pale shape move in Margaret's kitchen window. It bent, then straightened, and turned toward the door. I went to open the church door, and the bell gurgled like something waking in its sleep. The last sound I heard before the chapel door swung free was the neighborhood dog 2 houses down, howling once, as if to warn the world that something had come near. I went back to Willow Lane at first light. The air had an iron edge from the night's frost, and the town was waking up like a creature that had been startled, slow, suspicious, and very careful. News travels in Harrow Ridge the way wind moves through corn. Fast enough to rattle windows, slow enough that you can still catch it with both hands. By the time I walked up Margaret's path, there were already a few neighbors lingering on their porches, wrapped in coats and carrying thermoses, pretending the cold was the reason they were out there. Her door was unlocked. Inside the kitchen, the light was different than any ordinary mornings. It came from no visible lamp. It was a soft white from above, as if someone had opened a skylight in the ceiling and poured daylight down into a small room. The tea on the stove had gone cold. The plate of cookies was untouched. Margaret sat at the table, her hands in her lap, and she looked somehow younger and more exhausted at the same time, as if the night had both given and taken something from her. She motioned me to sit and then told me, very quietly, what had happened. She had been awake at 2:17 a.m., the exact hour that had haunted so many, and had felt a presence like a breeze without wind. At first she thought it was the dog scratching at the door or the television from the shop 2 houses down, but when she moved her head, the light in the room seemed to bend around a figure that stood in the corner like a promise. Her dress was the color of milk, Margaret said, and then smiled with a mouth that was almost ashamed of the wonder in it. She wore a blue sash. Her hands were open, and when she looked at me, I could feel my chest loosen. She smelled like lilies and baking bread. I know that sounds silly, but it's the truth. I asked if she had been dreaming. She shook her head. I could feel the floorboards under my feet. I heard things that were not words, and then they were words. She said, "You have been small and faithful. Do not bury the life left in you." She told me the woman, and she called her by that name, the one everyone in town uses in broken whispers, had sat down at the kitchen table, though there was no chair for a second silhouette, and had taken Margaret's hands in her own. Margaret's skin had warmed where the fingers touched, like the heat of a stove. She put a rosary into my palm. Margaret said, showing me the beads that lay there now, threaded with a small ribbon the color of sea glass. She told me to keep this near my heart. She said I would feel less heavy, that there was still a song I could sing. She promised me hope. For a town used to measuring miracles in the small things, a barn that didn't burn, a crop that turned from gray to green, this was something else. Some of Margaret's neighbors tried to make sense of it with practicalities. Maybe it was the new streetlight, someone said. Maybe it was the headlights of a truck. But others, the ones with long memories or empty chairs at the dinner table, listened and nodded because they had been waiting for a miracle that wasn't loud or messy, one that might come like a thread through a needle. When I pressed her for the exactness, what she saw, what she heard, she repeated a phrase that would later be told over and over. She didn't punish me. She gave me a reason to open my door again. That sentence landed in me like a stone in a still pond. Even now, I can feel the ripples of it in the town's conversation. Word spread like a river in spate. People came to Margaret's that morning, old women with starched collars, a high school teacher who smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and bitter coffee, and one of the teenagers who had been photographed stomping in the cemetery. Father O'Leary arrived in his collar and coat, his face the color of a man who had prayed late and been kept awake by thoughts that would not let go. He did not shout or scold. He sat quietly, folded his hands, and listened to Margaret describe the touch and the voice. "You were given a gift," he said when it was his turn to speak, "and gifts are not puzzles to be solved. They're to be received." His words landed like a benediction and made some people weep. Others had the practical concern of that same priest, how to care for one another in the face of something the town could not explain. Outside, the world moved with its ordinary cruelties. The hardware store bell tinkled. Tractors idled in a parking lot. But there was an undertow of something else, a sense that a hinge had quietly been oiled and the door might swing open. The teenage boy who came later to say he was sorry. He stood on the porch and looked small and clever and terrified all at once. Told me he had stayed up half the night, waiting for the town to explode into anger. When nothing did, when candles burned and neighbors murmured about forgiveness instead of retribution. He said he had walked slowly to the cemetery and found, to his shock, that the broken statue's head had been set upright on its shoulders. It was not whole. The hand was still missing and the robe bore a new crack. But its face was clean as if someone had wiped dust off a baby's brow. The police came and took notes. They measured footprints in the frozen grass. They interviewed people who said they saw no one and people who swore they saw a form moving across Margaret's yard at dawn, carrying something that shone like a spoon. The sheriff was a practical man with a soft spot for local superstitions. He called the restoration of the statue an unexplained human act and filed his report under a neat line that read, "No evidence of criminal activity. Community impact high." I spoke to the family of the original fisherman, an old lineage here, who still kept the worn shipping ledger of the chapel that had been burned. In a letter folded into that ledger, there had been a prayer in a child's hand from the late 1800s. "Thank you for the lady who washed our boat." The ledger also bore an ink sketch of a small wooden statue and a note, "Safe from the river, though I do not know how she stayed dry." The lore made people in Harrow Ridge feel less like witnesses to a single event and more like participants in a story that had been living beneath the surface, waiting for the right time to reappear. As the morning progressed, more unusual things gathered their weight. A woman named Lorraine, who runs the laundromat and never believes in anything she did not see with her own eyes, came to say that when she passed the old mill, she had seen the light on the hill. The same small beam of white that had been reported the week before. Blinked twice, and then slowly turned to face the town. The mill light has no electricity, she said, and the hill has no one living there. A child at the school playground said his teacher told him to draw what he felt, and the kids came back with pictures of a lady with a halo and a rosary that had beads like fish scales. Tension began to braid itself through the town. Some folks wanted to capitalize on a miracle, the tourist types who'd seen stranger things in other towns, and spoke in whispers about pilgrims and donations. Others bristled, saying faith should not be used to balance a municipal budget. The mayor, who is used to taking advantage of public feeling, kept his distance, aware that in a small town, appearances can turn on the smallest of gestures. But the hardest questions were quieter and stuck in the throat like bad bread. If this was a miracle, why Margaret? Why a small, lonely widow who kept her curtains drawn and her teeth unsweetened? Why now? The historian in me wanted to spool answers from past patterns, but the part of me that writes about a town's heart knew the simplest truth. Who we are when we're frightened, kind, or cruel is what matters. Margaret's visitation felt less like a selection and more like an invitation. Later that afternoon, a line of people started forming in front of St. Agnes. Some wanted to leave flowers. Some wanted to have their rosaries blessed. Some wanted to see if the broken statue had been further repaired or whether anyone could explain how it was placed back on its pedestal. The teenagers who had pushed the statue showed up with buckets and scrub brushes, their hands raw from hard work. They stood awkwardly, letting determination do the talking that their mouths were too young to manage. Then something happened that made even the skeptics stop. A woman who lives 2 blocks over and who has asthma so bad, she sometimes sleeps with an oxygen tank. She said she had not been able to climb the church steps for months because of wheezing and pain. That morning, she came forward without her usual cane, walked up to the altar, and placed her hands on the hem of the priest's alb. She walked out with a breath that was unlabored, as if someone had opened a window in a room that had been shut for a long time. She told anyone who would listen that when she had touched the cloth, she felt a warmth trail up her arms like a sunbeam and that her chest no longer felt tight. People around her wept quietly. Some rolled their eyes. Others bent their heads and let themselves believe. The town split into those who said it was cause for celebration and those who said it was a moment for caution. Father O'Leary called a meeting at the rectory to ask for prayer, but also prudence. We must not rush, he said. We must not use this to make claims we cannot answer to God for. He worried that human desire for spectacle could turn something holy into something profane. Still, when a mother of 3 came to him with a child who was pale and listless and asked him to lay hands on the boy, he did not hesitate. He prayed, and the boy's cheeks colored and the heavy humidity of his breath lightened. The mother folded herself over him and sobbed into his hair. There were other reactions, darker and meaner. A local radio host who likes conflict said people were gullible and that townsfolk were making money from superstition. A blogger who visited from the city sniffed that it was a well-executed prank. 2 parishioners who had long-simmering disagreements over wills and pew placement found their arguments dissolved into something less distinct, a fear of being wrong about what truly mattered. By dusk, the cemetery gathered a crowd. The statue had been set upright with care and wrapped in cloth once more. People stood in a circle, some with candles, some with their hats in hand. The teenagers from the photo had placed marigolds around the base in an unsteady bouquet. Someone began to chant softly, an old prayer half a century out of fashion. The wind seemed to circle the group like an invisible hand. At that moment, someone at the edge of the gathering, I couldn't see who it was at first, cried out. We all looked up and across the dark sweep of the hill, toward the little white house where the road bends and the old mill light stands. The church bell tolled once, slow and full, and though no one had touched the rope, the sound moved like a ribbon through the crowd. Then, like a hush that sweeps off a stage before an actor takes a bow, everything was still. When the crowd made its way home, it was late, and the town seemed to hold its breath. Some people folded their hands and prayed at their kitchen table. Some drank, hard and anxious, until the noise in their head matched the chaos in their heart. The teenagers walked home together in silence, their shoulders close and their footsteps careful. I went back to Margaret's house before I went to bed. The curtains were open now, and the small lamp she kept by the window gave off a gentle glow. On the sill, a single wet footprint, small, like a child's, led away from the house and toward the road, pressed into the frost and vanishing as if whoever had left it had stepped across a seam in the world. I called out, softly, and Margaret's voice came from inside. He was fine, she said. She had work to do. When I asked what work, she only smiled and looked down at the beads in her hand. People will tell stories differently after the morning we all held, each one lifting the parts that fit their life and folding away the rest. Some will say the statue was saved by an unknown hand. Some will say that a woman's prayer changed a life. Others, the ones with more brittle faith or more specific grievances, will say nothing happened at all, that a set of coincidences had simply made us feel less alone for a minute. The safest thing to say is that something changed the town that morning. Something that made people go to the church who had not been in years. Something that made a son drive the extra 2 hours to see his mother, and, when he did, hold her hands as if his life depended on them. I left Willow Lane with my notes and my recorder, and I felt, more than anything else, like a man who had watched a house open and close and who had been given half a story. The half that had been promised would unfold at dawn. There was in the air the metallic feeling of expectation, not all of it good. People who see miracles in small things also sometimes fear what comes after miracles. Attention, greed, the slow corrosion of a simple blessing into a spectacle. When morning finally crept up over the hills, the town was awake and full of people. The sheriff had more people than he needed on his morning rounds. Reporters from the county had parked out at the edge of Harrow Ridge like strangers who might need directions to the truth. The teenagers who had caused the trouble with the statue stood with their heads down. Margaret walked toward the cemetery with a calmness that seemed to have been grafted into her bones. She had the rosary in her hand and the small ribbon tied to a braid in her hair. She reached the statue and stood before it. And then the thing the whole town would speak of for years, the thing that would be interpreted as both sign and warning, happened. The statue's face, which had been clean and ordinary, seemed to tilt just enough to look directly at Margaret. For those of us close enough to see, its eyes were not blind. They were wet, as if with tears, and for a second, a brief and impossible second, the marbles seemed to pulse with life. There was a sound like a breath across the graves, like the turning of a page. The rosary in Margaret's hand slid free and landed across the statue's lap. Nobody moved. The air hung like a curtain. And then, from the crowd, someone, I do not know who, began to pray. The prayer swept through the people like a tide, pulling some to their knees and others to stand with hands outstretched. The moment felt more than human, more than the explanation of the sheriff or the logic of the blogger. For a breath, it felt holy. Then, as if a seam had been stitched back together and someone had tugged the other end, everything came undone. A scream cut through the crowd. Not a wail of joy, but a sound ragged with fear. People started moving, whispering, shouting, and someone ran in the direction of the road. There was a new sound behind us. A car horn, then more horns, then the low, frightened murmur of voices as people tried to understand what they had just seen. I pushed through the crowd to see, and the sight that met me at the top of the hill would be the one that split the town in two. But that sight deserves its own telling, and the morning had more to reveal than any one pair of eyes could hold. I stood there with my notebook open and my pen poised, and I realized the story was no longer mine to keep. It belonged to the town, to the people who had faith, and to the ones who had none. It belonged to something that had come down a quiet road at midnight and told an old woman she still had life in her. When the crowd scrambled toward the road, everything happened too fast and too slow at once. The way storms come off the sea, with thunder behind them and the smell of salt before the rain. At the top of the hill, I could see more clearly, not a crowd, but a single, narrow lane where headlights lined up like a string of frightened eyes. A truck, old, heavy, loaded with stacked logs, was rolling down past the bend, its brakes hot and useless. People on the shoulder stepped back and pressed their palms to their mouths. Somebody screamed for the driver to stop. The driver, a man who runs a construction crew and swore like a sailor, banged his fists on the dash and his knuckles shone white. At the same time, the statue's head had turned. It was not a trick of light this time. It moved as if looking past the stone into something the rest of us could not see. And from the margins of the cemetery came a column of pale light that grew like a dawn, slow and absolute. It poured over the graves and filled the space between the earth and the sky. The light landed on the road and the truck, tracing the wood, the metal, the driver's face. For a heartbeat, the world was quieter than a hell breath. Then a figure stepped out of that light. She was not the painted figure of our town statue. This woman, because she was a woman, wore a robe that seemed woven from the sky. Her feet did not touch the pavement. Around her head, a soft glow made the faces of the people near her softer still. People I had seen their whole lives bowed their heads like someone caught sight of a long-lost truth. The dogs in yards began to whine and then to whimper, the sound small and human. The truck, moving too fast and with a load that should have crushed anyone in its path, slowed as if drawn by an invisible hand. The driver slammed the brakes. The tires squealed. The heavy load shifted, rolled, and then ground to a stop within a few feet of the figure. People nearby said later that they saw motion in the air, like a current you could see, like breath lifted from a candle, that wrapped the truck and kept it from moving. The driver sat with his hands on the wheel, chest heaving, pale and shaking. He told the police he felt as if someone else had been steering. He said he smelled lilies and bread. For some, it was a rescue. For others, it was an answer. The figure walked toward Margaret, who stood at the foot of the statue with a rosary clutched. She had the look of someone who had been waiting a long time for a single door to open. The woman in the robe reached out and placed both hands on Margaret's shoulders. The touch was described later by 3 witnesses in slightly different words, but all of them said one thing the same. Margaret stood taller in a single, terrible second, like someone who had set down a very heavy basket. Margaret's face changed, something in it unknotted. The lines that had been there for years softened. She inhaled in a sound like a person finding the right note after years of singing wrong. She looked up at the figure and smiled, small and trembling, the sort of smile that makes people in the crowd weep if they have any heart at all. She did not scream. She did not faint. She stepped forward as if she had been given a cloak for her shoulders and a map for her feet. It was then that the figure spoke. The voice came like wind through chimes, clear, small, and impossible to mimic. It was not loud, but in that hush it filled every corner of the hill. The words, simple and plain, were heard and repeated by priests and plumbers and old women and kids, and each who heard it said the same thing later with the same tremor in their voice. She said, "Keep living. Be brave in the small things. Love the living." There was no thunderclap. There was only that sentence and the feeling that followed it, which was equal parts blessing and command. Some people fell to their knees. Others touched the earth with their palm, as if to confirm that the land still belonged to them. The truck driver later told the sheriff that when the phrase left the figure's lips, he saw with a certainty he could not explain that it was the same voice his mother had used when calling him in for supper as a child. He sobbed in his seat and said he had never heard a voice like that without tears rising. Then a strange and gentle thing happened. The statue at the base of the crabapple, our cracked, humble Madonna, leaned forward as if answering. For breath, the stone looked less like stone and more like breath. The beads that had fallen into her lap during the night moved as if with small, careful hands and slid across her knees like a river to the ground. Where they fell, something else followed, small physical healings. They were not dramatic resurrections like the stories in the thick books, but they were true in ways that make people change their lives. The laundromat woman with asthma who had walked up the steps without a cane the day before. She stood now and told anyone who would listen that the tightness in her chest had not returned since the touch on the priest's robe. A man with cataracts who had not seen the sunrise clearly in years wept when he realized the light over the town looked sharper. He could read the number on his mailbox for the first time in a long while. A child whose fever would not break found it had cooled, and she woke from a heavy sleep laughing and calling for pancakes. Nobody could prove that the beads had done it, that the light had healed these small ills, but people who had been sick found themselves whole enough to go on. There was also a less gentle aspect. The teenagers who had been seen in the photograph returned the following day to stand in the light, hands folded. One of them, the tallest who had been the one to push the statue, looked sick and raw. He whispered apologies into his sleeve and then began to tell people more. How the joke had been meant to be a stupid picture, how none of them had expected to break anything, how they had been terrified afterward in a way their parents never taught them to be. That night, some of the teenagers woke to nightmares and to the smell of lilies in their rooms. One of them, a boy with a history of taking dares to get attention, walked out alone to the cemetery and, in the fog, confessed to a priest on his knees under the crabapple tree. He later told reporters that for the first time he recognized what it meant to be small and sorry. Not everyone who came felt blessed. There were shouts of anger from people who had invested their sense of self in being right about everything. A radio host tried to rile the town into a frenzy, calling the events a hoax and demanding proof. A blogger from the city wrote a piece that reduced the scene to clever lighting and group hysteria, and those words stung like cold water to many who had been bathing in a kind of holy heat. But even some skeptics slowed in their scorn when, at the edge of town, a man who had been jailed for stealing as a youth, now decades sober and tending to a long list of regrets, lifted up his hands and told the public he felt forgiven for something he had never told anyone. People in the crowd began to sing hymns that a lot of them had only ever heard in funeral pews. After the figure vanished, and she did not vanish like smoke, but like a door closing so slowly you could count the seconds, the town stayed on the hill for a long time. No one wanted to be the first to walk away. We had seen something that broke the ordinary shape of our days and left a scar that was also a path. What followed in the weeks after was messy and human. Pilgrims came in modest numbers at first, some with rosaries and candles, others with curiosity and cameras. A national reporter came from a distant city and spoke of collective experience, a phrase that made some of our people bristle because it sounded clinical. The diocese issued a statement that called for prayerful discernment and for a period of reflection. The bishop asked that no relic be sold and asked that any money raised be used for charity. Father O'Leary, who had seen his own steadiness tested and then strengthened, reminded the congregation that wonder is not grant money and that miracles do not belong to anyone's pocketbook. The town had to decide how to live with what it had seen. Some families set up candles at small shrines in their yards. Others took down what they had done in fear of turning a sacred thing into spectacle. The teenagers who had once scuffed the town with a stupid picture made amends by volunteering at the community center, painting porches, and repairing the birdbath angels. The truck driver paid for the repairs to the statue pedestal and donated to the church fund anonymously. Margaret, who had been given a reason to open her door again, began to walk farther than the mailbox. She went to the diner for the first time in years and ordered coffee and conversation, and people who came in for slices of pie found themselves staying to listen. There were arguments, too. A group petitioned to create a yearly day of observance, a street fair that would sell rosaries and T-shirts. Others spoke against commodifying the sacred. The mayor tried to walk between the two and ended up pleasing neither. The town council put together a committee that was mostly made up of people who had learned to talk in the old, practical way about zoning and permits. In that committee's minutes, the word miracle was spelled out like a foreign language and then circled in ink. What none of the committees could control were the private changes inside people. A man who had not visited his sibling in years found himself on a bus to a city 2 hours away, with no suitcase, but a determination to apologize. A young mother stopped measuring her days by grocery lists and started teaching her child the names of saints as lullabies. The laundromat woman who had asthma took up gardening. She told neighbors the flowers tasted like Thanksgiving. As for the priest, Father O'Leary changed. He took to walking to town at dawn with a thermos and slow shoes. He listened more. Sometimes he would stand at Margaret's gate, and they would not speak, but they both would look at the crabapple tree and count the birds. Once, when asked, he said simply, "We are not asked to explain the things that change us. We are asked only to become worthy of them." There were quieter cautions as well. People who expected constant miracles left angry because the town did not rearrange itself into a place of nonstop wonders. Old habits are hard to break and even harder to explain away. Some who came hoping for spectacle never found the solace they needed and left convinced they had been cheated. It is part of the way people make meaning. If the world does not shape itself to your expectations, you either change or you rage. Harrow Ridge did a lot of both. Months later, when the seasons had turned and the hill had a new skin, green and then gold, a journalist asked me if I believed it had been the Virgin Mary who walked among us. I thought about the boy who had wet his bed and now made his bed every morning, about the woman whose walking was easier, about the man who read his mailbox number for the first time in years. I thought of Margaret, whose hands had stopped shaking when she stirred her tea. If belief is the sum of what keeps you going when the weather turns bad, then I believed. I said so in a way that surprised me. What stayed with me the longest was not the bright light or the careful miracles, but a sentence delivered in a voice that felt like home. Be brave in the small things. It lodged in the town the way a seed lodges in soil, persistent and patient. In the months that followed, ordinary bravery showed itself in small ways. Neighbors checking on each other, the teenagers bringing soup to old women, men sitting with sons who had been in trouble. The miracle did not become a permanent spectacle. It became, for many of us, a reason to be softer. If there is any punishment in this story, it was the sort of conscience hands itself when it is faced with truth. Some lives had to be rearranged. Some townsfolk had to feel the sting of their own neglect and choose differently. That kind of change can be as sharp as any thunderbolt. I cannot tell you that everything in Harrow Ridge is fixed. The roof over the pancake house still leaks in a hard rain. People still fight about small things and sometimes about big ones. But when November comes and the crabapple tree sheds its leaves, there's a lamp in Margaret's window and a single plate left on her porch as if for a guest who might pass by. Children who grew up here now know to pause on the road that bends by the cemetery and say a small private prayer. The statue has a new hand, carved by someone with steady and humble fingers. It is not exactly like the old one, but it holds the same soft shape. On nights when the air smells of frost and chimney smoke, you can still catch the faint scent of lilies somewhere between the church and the mill. On the edge of town, people swear they sometimes see a quiet light that moves across the fields and then vanishes like a thought. I do not know what all of that means. I only know what I saw and what it did. It gave a lonely woman back her reason to stand. It made some people kinder, and it forced others to reckon with what they had avoided. Thank you for listening to the end. If this story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe so you won't miss future tales that sit at the strange crossing of faith and everyday life. Your support keeps this little project going and helps bring more stories like Margaret's to people who need them. God bless and good night.